Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight to this wonderful facility. I love coming here. It's the coolest place, and I always remind these guys that they're so fortunate to work at the National Conservation Training Center. It's a really terrific facility, so nice to be back here. Nice to see all of you. I guess I am the warm-up act for the presidential debate later tonight. I promise no spin, and I promise to finish in time so that those of you who can't get enough of politics will be able to go see it, although I don't know who that would be at this point. But I'm sure we all want to go see the debate, so we will finish on time for that. Well, we're here to talk about Rachel Carson, and as Mark indicated, last month on the 27th of September was the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring, which is the book that Carson is probably most remembered for at this point in time, although she was a famous author before she wrote Silent Spring, and I'm going to talk some more about that tonight. This is Rachel, and I love this photograph. This is the frontispiece of the book. I spent about 7 months trying to find this photograph and then arrange to reproduce it in the book. It was made by Irving Penn, the great 20th century portrait photographer, for Vogue magazine. And it actually appeared in Vogue magazine, although it, again, took me several months to figure out exactly when and where. And in any event, it was made in 1951, so it hasn't been seen in about 6 decades. This is the lost photograph of Rachel Carson, and I think by far the best photograph of her ever taken. She would have been 44 years old in this photograph, and I just think it's terrific. Penn actually shot it this way. It's not cropped to look more artistic. That's the way he photographed her. Well, looking around this audience tonight, I suspect most of you know who Rachel Carson is. But I can tell you that generally that is not the case with a lot of people. Baby boomers and people who are older than baby boomers tend to remember Carson and her work. And young people in high school and college are studying Rachel Carson again in environmental studies classes, and they are more likely to know who Carson is. But in between, there's this great donut hole. Lots and lots of people who don't know Rachel Carson, don't know Silent Spring, and as a result, don't really understand the origins of the environmental movement, and as importantly, the debate and arguments that we have around the environmental movement, because they have their origins in Silent Spring and in the reaction to Silent Spring and in the historical context in which Carson was working. And these are questions that interested me a lot. This is part of the reason that I wrote a book about Rachel Carson. I wanted to try to understand where this movement came from, the role that she played in it, and why we have this partisan, divisive, right-left argument all the time about environmental matters. It doesn't seem logical. We all live in the same global ecosystem. This shouldn't be something that we can't agree on, and yet we can't agree on it. So Carson is the fault line, in my view, between two important aspects of our relationship with the natural world, two historical movements. The first half of the 20th century was about conservationism. And this was the idea that we should be good shepherds to the earth, that we should preserve the resources that we have, that we should preserve the heritage of wildness that the country was premised on for future generations. And this was not a particularly controversial idea. This wasn't something that people disagreed wildly about. There's always competing interests. It's never simple to conserve something if it's sitting in somebody's way. But basically, this was a nonpartisan concept. And in 1962, when Carson published Silent Spring, the conversation shifted to what I call environmentalism. Now, these terms aren't precise, they're not scientific, but they're useful constructs for thinking about what changed in 1962. Environmentalism is different from conservationism in several important ways. It's a little more pessimistic, not nearly as forward-looking. It's much more immediate, it's more urgent, more dire. And with the evolution of environmental thinking, we begin to focus more and more on ourselves. Where before the species of concern might have been a fish or a bird or a game species of some kind or forest, once we began to think about the environment and our place in it, the species of concern really became us. both what we were doing to the environment and what we were doing to ourselves in the process. So I think that when we look back 5 decades in the rearview mirror, we can actually see the beginnings of this change in the way we think about the natural world. And I call Rachel Carson a fault line, a tipping point between these two things. She actually had a strong presence in both the conservation movement, which I'll talk about in a minute, and was really, in effect, the founder of the modern environmental movement. And I think it's possible to actually point to a specific moment in time when that happened, when we began to think differently about the environment and our relation to it. And it came in the late summer of 1962, about a month before Silent Spring was even published. In June of 1962, the New Yorker magazine had published 3 long excerpts from Silent Spring. And through the course of the summer, a huge controversy flared up around the book, and people began to take sides on it. And people began to become worried about what Carson was warning everyone about. And by the end of August, this was very much on the public agenda. And so I'm going to show you now a little video that I think, as good as any other, identifies this tipping point, this place and time where we began to think about environmentalism.
At his press conference on August 29, 1962, President Kennedy was asked,
"There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-term side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides. Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?"
Yes, and I know that they already are. I didn't read, of course, Carson's book, but they are.
All right, so that's President Kennedy on August 29th, 1962. That was at the tail end of his news conference. I hope you could hear it there. He was, asked about pesticides and whether the government would do anything about it. Before they got to that question, there was a whole string of questions that turned out not to be unrelated, although it seemed like it at the time. Several reporters asked about this increase in Soviet shipping traffic to the island of Cuba. And nobody knew what was happening or what that meant, but of course, in a couple more months, we would know exactly what that was about. And that was not, in the end, unrelated to what Carson was talking about in Silent Spring. I hope you could also hear that the president referred to Miss Carson's book in his hands. He said, we are going to look into this problem, especially in light of Miss Carson's book. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that in 1962, no further introduction was needed. Everybody knew who Miss Carson was. That was Rachel Carson, the celebrated author of 3 books about the ocean, beautiful lyrical books about the ocean that were these wonderful transforming experiences for their readers. Carson had a way of taking science and translating it into really beautiful narrative that everybody could relate to, and so she'd become one of America's most celebrated and beloved authors. And with Silent Spring, she really turned in a very different direction. Silent Spring is a disturbing book. It's a worrisome book. It's a book that pointed out what we were doing to ourselves by the careless use of pesticides in many different places. Well, since it's not 1962 anymore, I thought I would explain a little bit more for you about who Rachel Carson was. She was born in 1907 in this house in Springdale, Pennsylvania. That's just outside of Pittsburgh, just up the Allegheny River a little ways. When Carson was born, she was born in one of the upstairs bedrooms of this house, which at the time did not have that addition on the right-hand side that you see. It stopped at that chimney on the right. A very simple, very modest house, 4 rooms, 2 downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs. There was no central heat. There was no indoor plumbing. They had a couple of outhouses out back. They had a shed in the front where they occasionally kept a horse. And it was a little bit out in the woods. It wasn't completely in the country, but there was enough property around the house that Carson could explore the woods, often with her mother as a child. And she really loved birds and animals and was fascinated with nature from a very early age. She was a gifted student and a talented writer even as a young woman. She published several stories in children's magazines before she got out of high school. And she earned a scholarship to a small women's college in Pittsburgh called Pennsylvania College for Women. which it's now called Chatham University. It's still there. A beautiful little campus.